Search strategy is mostly found in a systematic review. So if your thesis is basically one giant literature review, you're going to have a search strategy. And this is where critical analysis, engagement, intertextuality, academic writing, all those lovely terms your supervisor's thrown at you with a list of things to fix. So don't worry, I'm going to sort you out here. To go back to the point I made about systematic reviews, that is basically to get a nice detailed overview of the land. So you're kind of setting the scene for someone to come along and do original research later. And you're looking at different authors, you're looking at different methodologies. Why did this work? Why didn't it work? Did any of it work? So I'd like to welcome everyone back. This will be the first video of a series of videos on academic writing, and particularly the literature review. So this first video is going to look at the different aspects of the literature review, and I'm going to give you 3 stages of doing a literature review. So the hardest thing in doing the literature review is trying to figure out where to start. Most people, they kind of hate the chapter. That's why they usually leave it till the end. Or most people do get stuck thinking they have to do it very early on in the thesis, and that's not entirely true. You can get away with doing a draft of it, a skeleton of it, which will suffice. The main goal of the literature review is to situate your own research within the wider field, as well as reviewing the literature to see what is the lay of the land into which you're going to enter now. You might look at different studies as to say well, what are the gaps they've highlighted? Am I attempting to fill that particular gap? You can also look at different methodologies. Why do some scholars favor a qualitative approach over a quantitative? And why have some scholars chosen a mixed methods approach? So all these little questions you sort of ask yourself before you get into it. So I'm going to provide 3 basic stages in conducting your own literature review. Stage 1 will be the search strategy. And this is essentially where you're sort of looking through the literature that's there, looking at the methodologies they used, what are your inclusion criteria, how vast and how narrow are your parameters for seeking out the literature. Second stage is reading and critiquing that literature. And the third stage is editing and what I call beautifying the draft. So that comes at the very end. Search strategy is mostly found in a systematic review. So if your thesis is basically one giant literature review, you're going to have a search strategy. Now, if you're producing original research through qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, you still can conduct some sort of a search strategy. You don't have to go into the details of it, the intricacies of it. You don't have to show your reasoning for excluding and including certain literature. So when it comes to actually conducting the search strategy, you're going to use a combination of different words. And these can be terms that are used within the field or terms you feel will help either broaden or narrow the search for what you're looking for to answer your research question. And these can include, let's say we're doing something on music. So you might look up the search terms teaching music, music engagement, music education, boys and girls music, music at primary level, music at secondary level, etc. And sometimes you use Boolean searches, which is a combination of keywords such as and, or, and not. The word not there excluding whatever term you want to leave out of the search. And the word or expanding the search. With the word and, sometimes narrowing the search to, let's say, published work that might include both terms. So say if you said music and education, it'll look for everything involving those 2 terms. Well, how do you actually research? How do you go about finding these articles? Because every time I go to look them up, I hit a paywall, or I hit a site that asks for a login. And I always say, just check with your college, because your college should have paid these subscriptions to different databases. I'd also encourage people when they're conducting international research to remember also the Irish element of your research. So always contextualize your research within an Irish framework, and you should look for Irish journals and publications in relation to your topic. So as well as looking online through different databases, I also encourage students to seek out edited books, particularly books on the topic they're writing on. Because if you look through the bibliographies there, they'll give you a much more refined selection of books you may want to check out, which may not actually turn up on the actual database search. I'd also say check the bibliographies of different types of thesis on the subject. A lot of students there will find maybe other types of thesis and other types of literature that may not always turn up in those database searches. It's very important also to remember to prioritize the most recent publications, as these will often build upon older work. So whenever you're trying to compile a bibliography, it's nice to have more up-to-date literature. And that's frequently a criticism on most people's thesis, is that when checking through the bibliography, the most recent thing was, say, the early 2000s. And this can be especially troublesome if you've done something in education or especially healthcare, where things are moving at a sort of blinding speed. So always best to keep things maybe within a few years of where you are yourself. Obviously, if you're delving into a topic or a particular field, it's good to grab the most seminal and prominent writers within that field. So if you're delving into something such as education, you might want to grab stuff like Paulo Freire, Coulihan, Vygotsky, I can never get his name right, Vygotsky, or even stuff like Froebel. And in the social science, you might have Max Weber, Durkheim, while psychology, obviously Jung and Freud. So where else do we look? Well, policy documents are a good place to start. Education, health, justice, the department will produce something every year. It may not be completely relevant to your topic, but it's good to keep abreast of things because there may be something in the pipeline that you may need to highlight. Another invaluable collection is grade literature, which includes your company reports, conference papers, unpublished thesis. Unpublished master's and doctoral theses are actually a really great resource because they've sort of done the heavy lifting for you. When you read a published book, the literature itself is sort of embedded in the whole book, and it's sort of like, let's say, hidden among the sort of the flourishes of publishing, of the publishing world. But in an actual thesis, it's very raw, so it'll actually be called literature review, and the sections will have, you know, multiple headings, and they're very good signposts for where that particular research went. A frequent mistake people make is the second-hand sources. So what I mean by that is essentially a source that comes from someone else. Where possible, you should always get the original source. Sometimes it's unavoidable. My own thesis had a lot of those author in another author and then the year. And this is frequently because a lot of it was in a language I did not speak, so I was relying on another person. Now, if the two languages are English and you have access to both books, always grab the original source, because for whatever reason, sometimes it can be misconstrued, or you can have a situation where the author perhaps has a certain bias, not intentional, but maybe sometimes something was left out or the context was slightly just misconstrued. And we can see this especially in journalistic writings, especially if people get stuff from newspapers or even articles online. Sometimes they have a little bibliography at the end. Grab the bibliography and get those books yourself. Now, another frequent question is, how many references do I need? It's a tough question because it really does depend on your research question. So depending on how broad it is, it can be, you can have too many references. That's why it's always good to have a tight research question, something that sort of, the parameters are almost within the question itself. So let's say you're researching bullying in secondary schools in Ireland, in the west of Ireland. So you've narrowed it down. So you're only going to be looking at literature that deals with that specific topic. You will, generally in a literature review, you'll start off very broad and then you go specific, and then you become super specific, which is your research question. So there is a sort of a movement from the general lay of the land to the more specific research question you have. So we come now to stage 2, which is reading and critiquing the different literature you've compiled. And this is where critical analysis, engagement, intertextuality, academic writing, all those lovely terms your supervisor's thrown at you with a list of things to fix. So don't worry, I'm going to sort you out here. Most people, when they come for help regarding this chapter, they ask me, well, how do I research better? How do I read better? how do I critique? And I always say to them, well, look, I mean, it's not so much the issues with your chapter, the issues with your academic writing. People frequently ask me, how do you critique something? How do you review and read academically? Because you're sort of taught pre-college, when you read something or study something, you just regurgitate it back to me. So I'm asking you to review a book. Most of your review is going to be a summary of that book. And a lot of people, especially I do see it a lot in the movie industry, where someone reviews a film and 90% of the review is just a summary of it. But the main thing to remember when you're critically reading something is that it's not meant in a derogatory or disparaging way. You're basically assessing a work for its merit. You're going to say to yourself, well, what use is this, and what use is it to either the wider field, or what use is it to my research? When you explore different facets of a work, you're kind of looking at, what were its research aims, what were objectives, what methodology did it imply, did it follow ethical guidelines, what was the sampling procedure, especially if it's qualitative, quantitative. When you read and critique something, you're going to be looking at a few different parameters, facets of it, key points. So what are these key points? Well, number one, determine the nature of the article. Is it empirical or theoretical in nature? You're going to explore the researcher's aims and objectives. Number three, identify if a theoretical framework was implied. Number four, for qualitative research, you're going to discern the research question. Number five, you're going to assess whether the research effectively addressed the research question. Number six, in the case of an empirical study, you're going to examine the chosen methodology. Was it qualitative, quantitative, or mixed? Number seven, investigate the sample size. So was it large scale or small scale? Number eight, you're going to analyze the key findings, the results, and the outcomes. Number nine, consider whether the claims and findings align with the sample size, or if they were overly generalized. Number 10, for theoretical articles, identify the theory implied by the author and whether they provided criticisms of it. Number 11, delve into the values that underlie the research. Number 12, examine the conclusions drawn by the author based on the research. Number 13, assess whether there were any ethical concerns in the research process. And finally, number 14, scrutinize the presence of any inherent biases or prejudice that may have surfaced in the research. So what is the ultimate aim of doing all this? Why bother reviewing the literature? So to go back to the point I made about systematic reviews, that is basically to get a nice detailed overview of the land. So you're kind of setting the scene for someone to come along and do original research later. And you're looking at different authors, you're looking at different methodologies. Why did this work? Why didn't it work? Did any of it work? So I would say if you're doing primary research, so most of this channel is going to be geared towards doing primary research, so qualitative, quantitative, or mixed. So in that case, the literature review, its purpose is to throw up a lot of themes and topics. So these are the most pertinent topics that appear in relation to your research questions. The ultimate goal of that is when you come to do your findings chapter, you can then, whatever findings you have, you'll, let's say they're qualitative. In that case, you've done a thematic analysis, and that's going to throw up your own themes. And your goal then is to say, well, look, here's my themes. Here's my most important topics I took for those interviews or took from those surveys. And hey, look, they match some of the themes and topics that I reviewed in the literature. So the goal is basically to have something that will talk to your findings chapter later. And that's why it's very important to have a literature review that's a little bit sort of refined. The themes and the topics, they're working towards an end goal, which is your findings chapter. So all that brings us to our final stage, which is to beautify and refine and edit what you have. This stage is done, I would say, at the very end, and you can try and put yourself under tremendous pressure and try to do it all in one. I see a lot of people get stuck on chapter 2 for a long time. They contact me and they say, Bill, I can't, how do I finish chapter 2? And I say, well, what's your findings chapter look like? What's your discussion chapter look like? And they say, well, I haven't done it. Well, at that point, we're back to the same, how long is a piece of string? How many references? The literature review is really done at the very end. You can have a working literature review that more or less functions as a sort of, as I said, like a lay of the land. But how it's relevant or how much of that stuff in the literature review can stay there really depends on your findings chapter. There could be stuff that comes up in the findings that doesn't come up in the literature that you just reviewed. But I would say, well, that's an issue in itself, because that really should have been tackled earlier on by having really well-defined interview questions or survey questions that covers a broad range of stuff. The worst thing would be if you came to your findings chapter and you kind of said, okay, well, all these topics come up, but I didn't study them. They're not in the literature review. See, a thesis is quite artificial in its construction. You'll never have, well, I'm done with chapter 1 now, so let's go on to chapter 2, or I'm done with chapter 2 now, let's go on to chapter 3. They're always going to be in flux. You're going to do a little bit of 3, you're going to jump onto 4, come back and do a little bit of 3 again. Your discussion chapter will be it'll be almost done in tandem with your lit review and your findings chapter. Those 3 chapters really do, they're in a race together towards who can be finished first, and they all miss the mark. The research question will again define how done you are with your thesis. If you get to the discussion chapter, let's say, and you don't have enough literature in chapter 2, then you're not done, and then your literature review is not done. So you can't be on chapter 5 and say, well, I'm done now with chapter 5 if chapter 2 is still not done, because now you're going to have to go back and redo chapter 2, and as a result you're going to have to redo chapter 5. The long and the short of what I'm saying here is, don't be striving for ultimate perfection in chapter 2, because it will change, it will be in flux. But the most important thing is, if you're doing primary research, or if you're doing qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, just lock down the most important topics and kind of say to yourself, okay, I have 5 or 6 topics here that I'm seeing in the literature. Tailor your questions, your interview questions or your survey questions around those topics. So make those topics work for you. And that means then when you get data back from the primary research, it's matching what's in the literature review. That raises another point, which is the stream of consciousness literature review. That to me, when someone says, well, I've done a stream of consciousness, I've done it basically, I've regurgitated as much information on the page as possible. Almost like a Wikipedia article where it's just like literally blow by blow account. That's not what you're been asked to do. You're not being asked to produce a he said, she said, they said style narrative for those topics. You're basically kind of like what you're doing with the findings. You're taking the most salient themes or topics from the literature. You're kind of condensing it down and saying, okay, well, there's 20 books on this topic. I'm not going to put those every bit of knowledge in those 20 books into my literature review, because that'd be just bananas. You basically say, okay, my research question is about this particular topic, so I'm going to grab only information from those books that relates to my topic. Now we'll come back to this in a later video, how to read, how to research better, and that's a huge one there. But for the moment, I'll just say to you that your goal in a literature review is not to just regurgitate every bit of information. So that's the crux of the literature review. If I was to offer one bit of advice, one sort of nugget from this whole video, it's that don't be waiting to go on to chapter 3. Don't be waiting to go on to your methodology or your findings chapter until this chapter is done. Don't do that. Like, this chapter is never really done. Just get the most important topics out of it. Like, even if you do a skeleton literature review where you say to yourself, well, there's 5 or 6 topics here which I think are the most relevant and will help answer my research question. If you can just get them onto the paper and kind of say, okay, well, I have enough here now to go and write my interview questions or survey questions. That's plenty. That's a good enough basis for you to sort of go on without worrying and wondering, oh God, what if this topic comes up in the interview or the survey and I have no literature to refer back to? that sort of, if you follow my advice here, it kind of take care, you don't have to worry about that sort of stuff. The next few videos I'm going to focus on is really where it's all about, and they're all connected to literature review, and they have to do with academic writing, critical engagement, flow, how you read and review what's there. So until the next video, I will see you then.